Hello again, 240. In this video we will deal in part 1 with chapter 13, Do You Believe in Miracles? And it's not going to be a miracle like Miracle on 34th Street here in this 1947 www.oscars.org collection picture. This 47 movie won 3 Oscars, 3 Academy Awards, and it featured a young Natalie Wood. But we'll basically talk about the history briefly of the 1970s. And President Carter's wife, Rosalind Carter, called what was going on in the 70s a national malaise. Others had even less charitable things to say about the mood of the nation as the decade of the 1970s wound down. The decade had seemingly been one of the worst in the nation's history, right behind those of the Civil War and the Great Depression. It began with a rising tide of protests over the war in Vietnam that saw 4 students killed and 13 others wounded by the Ohio National Guard, tin soldiers, on May the 5th, 1970, on the normally placid campus of Kent State University. This is the first of 4 main events. And in the aftermath, hundreds of campuses erupted in riots. And this is the iconic photo from incolors.club. KDWD, Kent State Shooting Victims.hotmail, and this was in many magazines of the time. 4 dead in Ohio, said Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And Nixon's coming. And classes even were canceled in the spring of 1970. And then the second big event in 1973 occurred. The first oil embargo, the first energy crisis. And this was a flag that many gas stations would have. If they had a green flag out, everyone was welcome. If they had this yellow flag out, commercial vehicles or customers who had a real burden of proof could fill up. And if they had the red flag out, which many of them did, they had no gas. And this occurred because the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, of the Middle East or Southwest Asia, ladies and gentlemen, they shut off oil shipments to the United States. They quadrupled the price, more than quadrupled, from $3 a barrel to $18 a barrel overnight. And this produced severe shortages at the gasoline pumps and near panic among automobile-dependent Americans driving around in big cars that barely even got 10 miles to the gallon. And later that same year, it was revealed that Vice President Spiro Agnew had been accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes from road contractors with whom he had done business while a county commissioner in suburban Baltimore and as governor of Maryland. And the wave of scandal also engulfed President Richard Nixon. And there's a photo from an article by Nicole Hemmer in Atlantic Monthly on July 21st, 2016, www.atlantic.com, and that's Vice President Agnew and President Nixon. It had happened on June the 16th, 1972, the Watergate burglary of the Democratic Party national headquarters. In the investigation that ensued of this burglary, it piled up to the point where President Nixon had to resign, the only president in American history to do so, on August 8, 1974. What began as a third-rate burglary, as Nixon once described it, revealed an administration that had engaged in systematic criminal behavior, including illegal telephone taps, breaking and entering, bribery, and using the FBI and other government agencies to obstruct justice. As the American people grappled with the fact that their president and his top aides had committed felonies and systematically lied about them, they also saw their purchasing power suffer from rapidly rising inflation. And this is the fourth big event, the inflation of the 1970s. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, the country started paying for the 1960s in the 70s. And also on top of that, the loss of millions of jobs in the industrial sector. including the near collapse of the once dominant American automobile industry before the onslaught of foreign vehicles, mainly German and Japanese models, it raised serious questions about the future of the American economy, as Presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter wrestled with a stagnant economy. And President Ford talking about whip inflation now. They used to have those campaign buttons on in the campaign in the fall of '76. They didn't seem to understand what was going on. Stagflation was occurring, ladies and gentlemen. Simultaneous rising unemployment and inflation at the same time. And the fiscal-oriented economists could not explain this fact. It was not supposed to work that way. It's usually one or the other. If there's high inflation, then that means that employment is rising because people are making more and more money. But at this time, they're getting laid off at the same time that prices were rising. And normally when employment and that they do not go hand in hand like that. And that's going to lead to Reagan and Reaganomics then in the 1980s and supply side economics. As the end of the decade neared, news did not get any better. Another serious oil shortage in 1979 once more produced anxiety and long lines at service stations. In Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island nuclear accident occurred, and that's a picture from Reuters. Photographer Jonathan Ernst on March 15th, 2011 in the Duluth News Tribune.com. This was a nuclear power generating station that was crippled by a malfunction that for a time threatened a catastrophic meltdown. And with annual inflation at 10% and interest rates at times reaching 20%, the American people began discussing the possibility that the United States had entered an ominous period of decline and decay. In November, the hostage crisis erupted. And here are some Iranian revolutionaries taking an American hostage. And this happened in 1979. A group of angry Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran to protest the Carter administration's decision to protect the deposed Shah of Iran, who was living in exile in New York. He was there seeking treatment for cancer, which would kill him within the year. 53 Americans were taken hostage and held for more than a year. And this news was reported, the plight of the hostages, and this is www.iconicphotos.wordpress.com, and that's where the other photograph came from as well. And this is reported nightly, and Americans felt both angry and helpless as Uncle Walter Cronkite documented day 248 of the hostage crisis. Every day they'd have that running number for how long they had been held. And the Carter administration did attempt to rescue, but helicopters crashed on the way there. And again, this symbolized the sense that America had lost its way. They were unable to deal with this, and that doomed the Carter administration. President Carter correctly summarized American opinion when he commented that a crisis of confidence in a speech to the nation on television had enveloped the nation, striking at the very heart and soul of our national will. But on February 22nd, 1980, the fog began to lift as the American people were given an unexpected morale boost. And we will conclude in part 2 what this miracle was.